Good afternoon and welcome to Biztech Asian Midday Marketwatch. Our guest today is Vishnu, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank, coming in from Singapore. Vishnu, as always, great to have you on the show.
Always a pleasure to be here, Brian. Great way to start the week.
Now, Vishnu, before we get your insights, let's first take a look at how crypto markets are performing. So Bitcoin has been on a downtrend lately in the last couple of days. It's at 43,912.7, but it's actually up over a 24-hour period, 3.98%. Ethereum is at 3,115.96. It's up more sharply at 9.41%. Now, looking across regional stock markets, we've got the Nikkei, which is at 30,220. It's down 0.09%. Shanghai Composite is at 3,565. It's down 1.3%. The Hang Seng is at 24,259.75. It's up 0.28%. The ASX 200 is at 7,394. It's up 0.7%. The Kospi is at 3,129. It's up 0.13%. Closer to home, you've got Bursa Malaysia, which is at 1,527.27. It's down 0.31%. And rounding up the numbers, we've got the SGX, which is at 3,096. It's up 1.14%. So a very mixed bag. Vishnu, give us your insights as to why this is the case.
Well, I mean, it does look on many accounts that markets are not completely decided one way or another. So on the positive side of things, we've seen commodities rebounding very strongly. So you've got oil prices. In fact, Brent was earlier flirting with $80. You've got iron ore prices that had a very nice turnaround from the Evergrande related and property market related scare and sell off at $90, coming back up above $116. So we had a very strong commodity turnaround, and that's boosted the commodity space. And that has got spillover effect into the equity market counters, so on and so forth, including service providers. So those have given a bit of a lift. Adding on to that and complementing that is some soothing noises from Chinese policymakers, although it's quite cryptic. I mean, just that Evergrande should not default, but they have not offered details on how that default will be avoided. But the PBOC has been pumping in generous liquidity, continually surprising markets on the upside. So that has also assuaged the worst of fears. And I think that has coincided with a lot of the central banks in the G3, including the Norwegian central bank, all having a bit of a slightly hawkish take, but premised, and this is the main thing they're focusing on pretty bullish outlook. So those are the positive factors. But at the same time, I think markets have not forgotten that China risks are very iffy. It cuts both ways. And we continue to see headlines on regulations coming out, which means the downside risks remain. You also have got the US debt sitting overhanging quite precariously. If that's not resolved, US activity could start stumbling. And that's really not going to be good news for anyone. Perhaps not even for those who perversely watch for more Fed accommodation on the basis of the fiscal policy, faltering. So putting everything together, there seems to be a bit of a relief type of rally coming through, but the conviction behind it is not rock solid. And depending on your exposure to either delta risks, commodity risks, or China risks, it can play out quite differently, hence the mixed bag.
Okay, so Vishnu, I'm going to put you on the spot because this morning when I read your commentary, you brought exactly these three key points, but basically identified that the point of reckoning is going to be November. Now, could you give us your insights into how this story could play out and around these three scenarios? One, the potential for Evergrande's bond default coming home to roost because they've got a 1-month grace period, I think till late October. Then prospects for taper, and then also the debt ceiling threats. How is that going to impact, given these scenarios in November, Asian markets, currencies, and commodities?
Well, I mean, it looks like there is a not insignificant risk of a slow motion train wreck, because we will have a situation where liquidity could dry up very quickly because of the precautionary holdings and the fear in the markets. As you rightly pointed out, the Evergrande situation is probably given a month's grace. After that, if it's not given any kind of clarity on how it's going to be resolved, bond markets could start seizing up, particularly in EM Asia. You also have got the US debt ceiling. If that doesn't get resolved, typically markets anticipate that with 1 or 2 weeks of stuttering, it'll resolve. But if that doesn't, again, you could find markets seizing because of risk aversion. And finally, if markets are anticipating, by then, of course, Fed expectations could shift. But if the Fed rhetoric is that these are transient things and they are, they remain committed to taper sooner rather than later, then the prospect of taper kicking in as early as November could also come in. So you get a bit of a liquidity seizure. And at that point, it is not so much about how much liquidity markets still have, because many would rightly argue that markets would have a lot of liquidity, and in fact the authorities could be pumping in liquidity, but rather at that point the fear would be those who need liquidity are unable to access it because it's disproportionately held by very large financial institutions and not quite reaching out where it needs to. So that remains the risk. Against this backdrop, equities would probably fumble a bit. And then you also get commodities being very volatile, and in this scenario the dollar may be favored, where quite ironically and perversely, because obviously it's a US debt ceiling crisis, but you could still see the dollar favored after a bit of volatility, that is.
And so I see this movie that's been played out before, and I see this movie playing out about 12, 13 years ago, and maybe I think Long-Term Capital, I can't remember when exactly that was, but that was another movie that this looks very, very similar and quite worrying, Vishnu. But let me ask you this. For the rest of the week, what are the key data points and events that we should be looking out for that is going to impact markets and therefore the way we invest?
I think for me, personally, I am not even looking at data. For me, what I want to look at is all the headline risks. So I want to look at how the German elections outcomes are perceived, because that could give the euro a temporary boost and then the dollar could shift. Chinese headlines remain very important heading into the October holidays for China, because then markets will dry up after that, and so those headlines remain very important. But nevertheless, I think markets will still be distracted by things like Chinese PMI coming through. Of course, looking at it in concert with PMIs in Europe, in US, looking at how the recovery is holding up. In the region, we have got Bank of Thailand. We particularly want to see Thai baht has been the worst performing currency, so we want to see what the BOT says, especially given that at the last meeting, more of the BOT voting members, there was some dissent insofar that some wanted a rate cut. How to balance that off with Thai baht stability risks, those are worth watching for people looking at particular markets. We also have got Vietnam's GDP coming, showing that Q3 is not a pretty picture for most. But I don't think we ought to get distracted from the fact that the evolving Chinese regulatory story and the property backstops, that I think will not give us any reprieve.
Now, Vishnu, as always, thank you very much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Now, we've been speaking to Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank on Biztech Asian Midday Marketwatch. I'm Fernandez. Please check out our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our various platforms. Please like and subscribe to them. Thanks a lot for tuning in.